how much influence can one individual have in engaging their personal shadow, right? Think about it this way, right? Dr. Carl Jung, his journey started with engaging his own shadow, essentially, bringing those elements into his conscious view. Just think about the insane rippling effect that procedure, that experience had on the rest of the world. Just him engaging, like if he was just a psychologist, just so he wrote some substantial papers and whatnot, how different his path would have gone, versus he had this breakdown 1913 and he starts engaging, his inner depths and has these visionary experiences and starts to write everything down and analyze it and starts to understand that, this is the experience everybody shares. And what kind of crazy rippling effect that had, that starts with that one seed idea of somebody engaging with their own inner depths and then revealing it out into the world.
Welcome back to the transmission, my friends. I remember back before I integrated my shadow, I was so reactive, so low vibration. I'm joking. I really wish I didn't have to say that, but inevitably, I know there's going to be some small percentage of people whose sarcasm antennae don't work. On that note, I feel like the shadow has a way of sneaking up and bitch slapping people especially hard who think they've rid themselves of it. I don't even think that this dark territory of the unconscious that Carl Jung called the shadow can ever be fully known, can ever be fully integrated. But clearly it's hugely important to have some level of shadow fluency, to do some degree of shadow work, because if we remain just completely oblivious to it, we will, to paraphrase Jung, just be led around by the shadow to a point where we just think it's fate. We just think that it's the world happening to us, that it's the way things have to be. But the shadow definitely goes far beyond our individual psyches. It is at work out in the world at large, as we riff on in this mind meld. Jung and his ilk absolutely believed that there are shadows of groups, of nations, of the collective. We see this not only in geopolitics, but as we also muse in this one, myths and fairy tales, both of which shed light on massively important archetypal truths about the psyche and the world, however dark and inconvenient at times. And joining me in said discussion is my brilliant wonder brother, MJ Dorian. He's a kindred spirit. He is a multimodal creative, an incredible musician, an artist, a fellow student of the Esoteric. MJ is the creator of the utterly fantastic Creative Codex podcast. His series on Jung and Alchemy is my favorite. His new one on Blake is just stellar as well. All the links that you will need for MJ Dorian are in the description. Same for Third Eye Drops. And on the note of this show, do us some altruistic button booping. I'd be truly grateful. Like, sub, comment, share. It is all immensely helpful. And did you know that Third Eye Drops is not only available on audio podcast platforms, we've got hundreds of audio-only mind melds that you'll never be able to hear on YouTube. So give Third Eye Drops a sub wherever you listen. And if you want to support these transmissions more directly and also be fully initiated into our Wonder Lodge, join up over at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops. We've got a patron-only Discord server. We do a book club. We have monthly Wonder Gym hangs on Zoom. You can get rewards like stickers, pins, shirts, and more. We are waiting for you over there, my friends. Would love to riff with you. But for now, speaking of riffing, let's do so with my wonder brother, MJ Dorian. One of my favorite people to rap with, to goof with over text messages, and just really chop up all things mythopoetic with, because you never cease to impress me with your mythopoetic prowess and background and dedication to digging into things that I'm also so interested in, but you do it in like a little bit of a different way, or maybe not even a different way. It's just by nature of me being a person and you being a person, you're down some rabbit hole, I'm down some rabbit hole, and it always coalesces into some really, really familiar territory. So I love riffing with you in general and having you on the show, man.
Yeah, no, it's always a pleasure, and it always gets me thinking about things from some unique perspectives too, with what you have to offer. So like even just recently, from what I can get us started in with,
Sure.
is that I've been really interested in Grimm's fairy tales, specifically the ones that predate the kind of modern pop culture versions of Cinderella and Snow White and all of these. But there's actually a few hundred more that the brothers Grimm transcribed from original folk tales being told in these small German towns and such that they transcribed into these books. So in the original Grimm's fairy tales, there's surprisingly a lot of dark and even violent elements that kind of have been defanged from these
Yeah.
tales nowadays. But like some examples are in the original Cinderella, the two stepsisters who try to get their feet into the magic slipper, they both disfigure their feet to try
Mm.
to make the slipper work. So the first sister, the stepmother hands her a knife and says, "Here, chop off your big toe,
Whoa.
because once you're a queen, you're not going to need to worry about walking anymore." So the stepsister does it. She gets that slipper on, gets to the prince, and then the woodland animals say, "Look at her slipper, it's covered in blood." And
Wow.
there's this whole scene where the slipper is filled with blood, as you can imagine, and the princess is like, "I didn't sign up for this," brings her back. The next stepsister gets tested, and the mother tells her, "It's not fitting, cut your heel off." So she does. And this same scene happens, blood on the slipper. And there's just these endless examples throughout the Grimm's fairy tales of things that are a bit gruesome, a bit morbid, people getting hit in the head with axes, thieves hanging from the gallows. You have the end of Snow White, the evil queen. She is forced into red hot steel slippers. And during the wedding, she's forced to dance until she falls down dead, like
Wow.
as
Yeah.
punishment. And then maybe one final one, again from Cinderella. By the end, the stepsisters get their eyes pecked out by Cinderella's pigeons as like a final little like F you to them for what they tried to do and how they treated her. And just this idea that there's, because of those images and those scenes, I mean, it adds so much more emotional intensity to the stories
Yeah.
that we end up missing. And also, it implies that these weren't kids' stories. These were being passed around, and they served a different purpose in the culture that they're from. And a lot of them also have hints of the former influences, like Norse influences in the culture and stuff like that.
Hmm.
So, yeah, they're a real treasure trove of really this wonderful weirdness.
For sure. Yeah, and the other thing that we were talking about too, that kind of spawned this whole, recent back and forth between us is the very clear relationship to these dark mythopoetic elements that we've defanged, as you said, and their relationship to the shadow archetype. And this is why, at least partially, Mary Louise von Franz, and Jung himself were so interested in these stories because they contain this archetypal material and this sort of
Hmm.
archetypal mechanism, and way to sense make. Like, I mean, even just right off the top of my head, in those stories you have these wicked stepsisters, right, who are tormenting her, and then there's this kind of like natural or divine justice visited upon them for their,
Hmm.
like, for their just being shitty abusive people. And it reminds me, for instance, of things like how, what's one of the conventions of all of the old Greek myths is like the last thing you ever want to do is get too big for your britches in front of the gods, because they will humble you, they will punish you, they will
Right.
show you what your correct position is. Um, and it seems like this is another version of that, that every culture somehow intuitively understood that this is the way things shake out, or perhaps this is the way the psyche wants things to shake out, because there's like,
Mm.
we can't, I guess there's two ways to look at it. Like, one way to look at it would be that the world is not just, terrible things just happen, therefore we need to create some kind of cathartic justice through myths or something. Or the other way to look at it is that no, there really is, the psyche consciousness will find a way to make things balance out, will find a way to create a sense of balance and justice in the world, even if it takes time and multiple lifetimes and, human intervention or something like that. But yeah, either way, those dark elements of myths are doing something very, very important. Those dark elements of fairy tales are doing something very important. And
Yeah.
I think we're losing that leads to, I think, really complex, um I mean, what better example is there of like shadow repression than removing that stuff, right? From our
Oh, right.
stories. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's like that's very true. It's like we're repressing the stories themselves, like the elements that maybe we're uncomfortable with, right? And then there's also really fascinating aspects when one starts to see the stories in more of a totality. You start to notice that God isn't mentioned.
Mm,
Like, and this comes from a European tradition, these stories, and God is hardly in there. Like maybe a few of them is mentioned in passing in a phrase or something, but you have to assume that it's because those stories trace back to earlier pagan roots. And that starts to explain why nature takes on the role of like the
yeah.
revenger in these stories. Like it's nature that a lot of times causes the revenge aspect. And, of course, you can argue psychological elements there. But at the same time, I think that's important to point out that those stories have an inherent respect for the damage nature can do, and a sense of reverence and mystery about it. And you have to assume that part of it is because it comes from traditions that are animistic traditions
Hmm.
that not only see the gods in nature herself, but also have an inherent reverence and respect for the damage nature can do on one who's perhaps foolish. And then it's fascinating because they always take place not in our reality, but in this place of a magical realm that Marie-Louise von Franz terms the land of the soul.
Hmm.
And this is partially because the place that those stories exist in, they don't function logically. All the animals talk. The plants
Yeah.
can have their own say about things, and the world functions in a different logic, and it's not even dream logic. It's just what she termed the land of the soul.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, but I do see the relationship between dreams there. Like just the other day, I
Hmm.
personally had a dream that was like where I felt like I was communicating with things that I wouldn't normally be able to communicate, at least directly with, you know?
Hmm.
Like I had this weird dream that seemed extremely archetypal that I have not quite worked out yet, where I was in what was very clearly my apartment in this dream, but it was not
Hmm.
my where I actually live. And it had all of this art that seemed very mythopoetic. Like there was this art that looked kind of like a Renaissance painting of like, almost like Michelangelo type figures, like very like beautifully painted oil paintings. Um, but not any real painting that actually exists. And then at a certain point, I was like really just interfacing with the painting, and the eyes started moving in the painting and like looking at me. But there was
Hmm.
all of this kind of like like just this deep sense of familiarity in that place. Like I had been to that place so many times. And it was one of those dreams that was like disturbingly coherent. Like I really felt like I was
Hmm.
in this place, like I was communicating, like I said, with the pieces of art, with the building itself, just all kinds of stuff like that. And there is, even though, Mary Louise von Franz is saying this isn't dream logic, I think it's very adjacent to what we could
Sure.
call the sort of like unconscious or the psyche or the underworld, even in the sort of James Hillman sense, where everything is made of psyche. I forget exactly what he says in Dream in the Underworld, the James Hillman book, but he essentially
Hmm.
straight up calls out that the underworld, the building blocks of the underworld are psyche. Um,
Right.
and I think whatever we're talking, and the dream, as the sort of chthonic, um, version of Olympus shows, it's like all the sleep gods are related to the underworld gods, the death
Hmm.
gods. Like they're all part of um, the same lineage. So yeah, there's something there for sure. And then that also is just so all of that underworld imagery is so evocative of shadow stuff as well, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And so, no, you touched on something. I love what you said, that, let's say, those stories, they're made of psyche. And I think that really gets to something at the heart of what a fairy tale is, and why it gets transmitted through generations and generations like that. And Marie-Louise von Franz does kind of touch on this when she says, asks the question, what is the difference between a myth and a fairy tale?
Mm-hmm.
And she distinguishes fairy tales by saying that they are more rooted in universal archetypes that are part of the psyche and archetypal processes. And so what you end up seeing with fairy tales is that they aren't limited to one region that they're in, and so they'll travel from one town to another, from maybe neighboring countries, and then the characters will change. The names will change to regional names, but the inherent structure will remain the same.
Okay.
And because they don't have gods, the gods aren't included. And then we see in myths, of course, those are, although largely built on archetypal material, they include a lot more of the culture that they originate from, right? They're
Okay.
born out of usually a religion or a set of gods, or one god, or a mythic story, and that's threaded in within the myth, and you can't separate the two. To understand that myth, you have to understand the context of the culture and usually the religion. While fairy tales, they get passed around, and she says that hence they're, like you said, much more made of psyche and made of these archetypal figures and processes. Like, we could even point out the thing we mentioned about the stepsisters in Cinderella,
Mm-hmm.
and this idea that not only were they willing to disfigure their own feet to achieve potential for fame and riches,
Yeah.
but their mother was too.
Right.
And
Yeah.
their mother was the one that insisted it. And so this presents us with a psychological reality that maybe even you or I have crossed paths with someone like this, who would be willing to put their own body in jeopardy, who maybe would disfigure themselves, who would risk maybe even their loved ones for fame or riches. I mean, this
Mm-hmm.
is a common aspect of even modern culture, unfortunately. And the idea that gets kind of like defanged from the story, and then it's just like, oh, they really want it. We lose that edge to it, that
Yeah.
realistic edge of uh, that still to this day is true, because it's describing something about our very real, deeper psychology. The way humans function.
Yeah, man. And think about what you lose too by removing that whole element of the story in the popular Disney version. Like you lose that entire like because like you could think of, disfiguring yourself in any way for the potential of fame. I mean, it's very clear what that is implying, that there's a certain type of self-compromising that people are willing to do for
Mm,
any kind of perceived egotistical societal advantage, right? And
right.
when you do that from a Jungian perspective, clearly you are forsaking your individuation. Like clearly
Mm,
you are like trying to get the ego to ascend this sort of like self-damning throne, like,
mm,
and I mean that by like capital S, self-damning throne, where
right.
you're trying to push down whatever you are on the truer level to crown the ego in some way, right? In this case, in the Cinderella story, to become a princess, or um whatever it is, and you completely lose that entire thing in the Disney version. There is no,
Right.
that I recall, at least. Is there any dumbed down version of that even? I know
They don't
they all
disfigure
try to.
themselves. Yeah, they
Yeah,
they they,
yeah,
they try to slip into the slipper.
yeah.
They can't. The mother certainly doesn't present them with a knife and say,
Hmm.
"Just hack it off." You got to. And
Right.
the prince certainly doesn't discover a bloody slipper. It's important to point out that also in the original, the slipper and Cinderella's dress is also gold.
Hmm.
So this harkens back, of course, to more ancient associations, alchemical associations of
Yes.
kind of purity and perfection of spirit that she has, that she's able to wear, that the other earthly beings, they can't even fit into, and all these wonderful associations. And in the more modern version, a glass slipper, right? It is, and which kind of loses a lot of those symbolisms.
And there's definitely a fatalistic aspect to it as well, which is obviously just rife throughout this whole animistic way of thinking and polytheist way of thinking that goes as far back in the ancient world as
Mm,
you can go, that you have a fate, like you have a particular
mm.
thing that you are supposed to live out, become, grow into, and you cannot alter that fate. Even if you're willing to like literally, cut pieces of your body off it to fit into like this role, that's not really who you are, and you can't force yourself into a box you don't belong in without doing great damage to yourself, and then also just being like a round peg in a square hole in a round peg, whichever direction that saying goes in. um it's yeah, and it's like, like laughably, of course, like a prince is not going to want to marry a woman whose like foot is gushing blood. Like that's essentially what you're trying to do by like forsaking
Right,
who you really are to do something that you're not meant to do. And
right.
yet again another element of the story that's just completely missing when you remove these seemingly darker aspects. And I wanted to get into too, before we get too far away from this concept of the shadow, one of the specific things that um, started right in the beginning is that is you shared this quote from Mary Louise von Franz about Jung talking about the shadow in a very blunt, very straightforward way. Because there is
Right.
this problem when we talk about the shadow, that it is
Mhm.
innately nebulous. It is innately just like, what are we even talking about here? And then, shadow work. How do you work on something that is so nebulous and so dark and so unconscious? And then there's the added problem of people just using the keyword shadow on YouTube or shadow work on YouTube, and they have no idea. They don't know anything about Jung. They don't know
Sure,
anything
it's
about his
fused with
real.
like a new
Yeah,
age kind of
yes,
view of the
yeah,
self and spirituality and stuff. I mean, I think it's useful to even read it. I have the book open here.
cool.
So this
Yeah,
is
please.
from Shadow and Evil in Fairy Tales by Marie Louise von Franz. So, in Jungian psychology, this is von Franz speaking, we generally define the shadow as the personification of certain aspects of the unconscious personality, which could be added to the ego complex, but which, for various reasons, are not. We might therefore say that the shadow is the dark, unlived, and repressed side of the ego complex, but this is only partly true. Jung, who hated it when his pupils were too literal minded and clung to his concepts and made a system out of them and quoted him without knowing exactly what they were saying, once in a discussion threw all this over and said, "This is all nonsense. The shadow is simply the whole unconscious." He, he said that we had forgotten how these things had been discovered and how they were experienced by the individual, and that it was necessary always to think of the condition of the analysand at the moment. So, in the first stage of approach to the unconscious, the shadow is simply a mythological name for all that within me about which I cannot directly know.
Hmm. Yeah, that really makes it a lot more straightforward.
Right.
And then I think you were saying too that I want to get more into what when she fleshes out the concept of the shadow a little bit more. But it would make sense that, starting there puts you on very clear territory, that okay, the shadow is the entire unconscious. It's everything about myself that I don't know. Like that makes so much sense,
Right.
right? But at the same time, then you've got to draw some kind of line around it, right? Because if you don't, it's just completely nebulous and completely like, okay, there's basically like this ocean of unknown stuff. So how do you begin to explore this ocean of unknown stuff? And
Right.
you've got to like personify it to some degree. You've got to start
Mm.
thinking about how can I, because the mind just wants to anthropomorphize everything, right? Like
Sure.
I forget
Sure.
where I came across this quote, but it essentially boils down to like one of the very first things the psyche wants to do is anthropomorphize the unknown, like
Mm.
ascribe some figure to it,
Right.
some personality traits, some I think it was actually when I was doing research about UFO stuff for one of my recent podcasts, right? Because um even UFOs like show up as bipedal,
Mm.
pentadactyl, things that either must have literally evolved physically in a similar way to us, or this is our minds projecting something that is at least somewhat familiar onto something that is absolutely unknown. So this
Right.
happens too in psychology, obviously. Like, okay, there's this unknown thing. So how do I incarnate this unknown thing? And I think there's advantages to that and disadvantages to that. The advantage is now you can interact with it. The disadvantage is you start to believe that this personification you've created is actually what it is. And I'm guessing
Right.
that that was Jung's problem. Is he's like, hey,
Hmm.
yeah, personify it, think about it this way, but that's not the map isn't the territory essentially.
That's so true. No, you're absolutely onto it. And in the following passages, she does mention that one of the first stages of this kind of engagement with the unconscious, and paying attention to your dreams and such, is that the shadow, the unconscious, becomes personified, most often as a figure of the same sex as the dreamer. And in my case, in my experiences with active imagination, it was myself, in all black with a hood. And this makes sense now in that context. But the idea being what you're saying, that that isn't the be all end all figure
Yeah.
that you interact with. This now becomes one of these elements of, like, the way they usually describe as an archetype bubbles up into consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
Consciousness itself colors the archetype and causes it to split, usually into a duality of like light and dark, causes it to also become personified into something rather than just exist as a potential form. And yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, it just becomes like an emissary of the
Right.
underworld or an
Yeah,
emissary of
totally.
the unknown. And there's really
Yeah.
this entire ecosystem of forces and images and archetypes that it comes from. And this reminds me of something that really, really melted my brain when I was talking to. Do you know Jeffrey Kripal?
I'm not sure I'm familiar with his work.
You would absolutely love him. He is a religious studies professor from
Hmm.
Rice University, and he studies all kinds of like paranormal and esoteric phenomenon that's not just more contemporary, but a lot of it is more contemporary. So he'll look at um, psychedelic experiences and UFO experiences and near death experiences, and he takes it
Mm.
all very seriously and takes it very literally, not in the sense of the images, but very
Right.
literally in the phenomena. Like like he thinks the phenomena of all that people are experiencing is real. But where he
Right. Something is
becomes,
happening. Right.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But where he becomes incredulous, or maybe not incredulous, but where he becomes not literal is in the
Mm.
images that present. When people come away from a mystical experience or a psychedelic abduction, whatever it is, and they say, I met Jesus or I met whatever because of this exact thing that we're talking about, this thing that the psyche does, where, and even when we say the word, this thing that the psyche does, like, what are we saying? We're saying that there is something in our perception, in our awareness that projects an image onto an unknown thing,
Right.
completely unconsciously, completely outside of our egos. And whatever that thing is very interesting and mysterious. And it gets me thinking about like the daimon right away. Like there's
Mm.
something that is both part of us, but is separate from us, or at least autonomous from our conscious mind, that like chooses somehow to show us a thing, and that is so
Sure.
interesting and strange.
No, it's completely fascinating. And, you know, one of the other wonderful little passages in this book from Marie Louise von Franz on fairy tales is she asks then the question, well, how do fairy tales come about? Because some of these stories, they feel very dense with material, and it's hard to
Hmm.
explain what's going on. Like, why would somebody write a story like this? How does this, there's no authors of these things. And so she says, because of their very likely kind of ancient origins, that one way a story like this may have come about is through someone in the town, in the village, having an intense dream or vision in a trance state. Something like, you had mentioned, this dream of yours. Oh, well, dreams, are narratives as well. And so it's possible that someone had this dream that isn't even a personal dream, but maybe kind of one of these rare collective dreams where it's significant to the culture of their time, and they're very, woven into the fabric of their society. And
Hmm.
so they have this dream, they share it, with someone, and then it feels relevant, and they don't even really know why, it feels
Right.
relevant. It just rings true, maybe to a problem that village has been encountering in the last few years. And then it starts to get retold, and then people tell it over the campfire, people tell it to each other over a beer, and they're entertained, and they still don't really know why, but it's somehow resonating with like an unconscious aspect, a problem, something unspoken in the collective shadow,
Yeah.
and it's serving something. So it's interesting to consider that that might be the way these tales come about too.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this makes me think of two different things. One is the way information used to spread before
Hmm.
media and before the internet is just such an interesting phenomenon in and of itself, and I think has sort of collective shadow or zeitgeist sort of implications, because you and I are like the same age, so we were um children of the 90s, and we straddle this pre and post internet world. So we saw this strange phenomenon of like rumors and urban legends and things that would just like organically spread, and everyone,
Right.
like without fail, almost everyone I've talked to who's my age, no matter where they live, they had the same weird these stories that would just had probably no factual substance to them whatsoever. I mean, even something like Bloody Mary, right? Like just like looking in the
Sure.
mirror and saying Bloody Mary. That is an extremely old transatlantic origin idea. Like, but
Mm.
for whatever reason, even by the 90s in America, like every kid knows this shit, you know?
Right.
And the fact that there's something in the collective psyche, in the collective spirit, that wants to spread these rumors, that wants to spread these weird cultural memes, I think that that does point to something strange or some kind of collective zeitgeist that just naturally flows, and you find yourself doing, like, I remember going in the mirror and saying Bloody Mary or
Right.
whatever.
And I remember that myself.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and you just find yourself regurgitating it for some reason, and
Right.
yeah, what is that? Like, what is that unconscious force? And I think that the only things that make sense to me are some of those things that Jung identified, like a collective shadow, like a zeitgeist.
Yeah, the concept of the collective shadow has had me like really reflecting lately, both in just from this book she talks about it, and in some of her lectures and such. And just that concept is a really fascinating and dark side
Yeah. Mhm.
of just humanity to consider. And just you know and she mentions something to the effect of that, you look at the people of Sweden, they have a collective shadow, and then the people of the United States have a collective shadow. They're
For sure.
different, there's different things in that shadow, but they all the countries and collections of people, even just a group of people that get together, 10 or more, they there's these unconscious forces that kind of are in the background, and in traditional times, medieval and earlier, that's what we would call a demon. Like
Yeah.
you went somewhere, and then you say, I don't know why, but I was possessed by the devil, and then I came home and I'm free from that force, and you couldn't quite put your finger on what that was. But it's these, you see it most clearly in these moments where there's a gathering of people, and the most obvious ones is when they do something violent,
Right.
or they're driven to like assault one person specifically, and they act like animals basically.
Right.
It's like it's like what the Italians did to the body of Mussolini, like after
Mm.
the Third Reich fell, and then they found him, they grabbed him, and they everybody that could get to him basically like kicked the life out of him, and they
Wow.
hung him, and then everybody spat on him, and they basically, it's all these people who in their day-to-day life would never think to do anything like that to
Yeah.
anybody. You would
Mhm. Mhm.
never think to punch anyone, would never, because that whole society would be completely fallen apart if anybody entertained those kinds of things. But then they're presented with this scenario where there's a collective, and they all now like have this repressed violence, this aggression come out to the fore, and they have this one figure they can all cast it on. In a
Hmm.
sense, this is the traditional scapegoat, and then they all
Yes,
run
yes.
to it, and they're just taken over by this, in a sense, a demonic force, to use that symbolism. But yeah, it's wild that that happens.
Yes. Yeah, I was just thinking about that, the scapegoat idea with what you were saying. And James Hillman also used to say something, and I unfortunately am flailing at remembering the exact quote, but it was something to the effect of like, the disease of the polis is the disease of the emperor, or something to that
Hmm.
effect. And there's just this old trope in a lot of stories that the healing thing sometimes that needs to be done is the death of the unjust leader, because the unjust leader
Mm.
is
Right.
is somehow the like psychic locus of a literal sickness. Like if there's a
Sure.
literal actual plague breaking out in society, sometimes what you need to do is either literally or symbolically like get rid of the locus of that disease and
Right.
kill it. And like, in the case of like Caesar or Mussolini or any of these people, like I think the people feel like they need the catharsis of the actual sacrifice of that
The
figure
figurehead.
somehow to
Yeah, the
begin to
figurehead.
begin
It
to
represents
heal.
so much more.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, totally.
And man, that gets into something, just so many interesting things too about fate, about what leaders are in terms of like what is really controlling them, like what is really
Mm.
the sort of hidden hand behind like the thing that elevates one person to such a ridiculous level of power. Like with some of these autocratic leaders, for instance, I mean, it's very easy to just, yeah, I mean, that's what Jung thought about Hitler, right? Is that he was like
Mm.
somehow a like projection of Wotan, or like he was a constellation of Odin
Right.
slash Wotan. Um, so yeah, I mean, I don't know, but I definitely think that this idea of collective shadow, of archetypal possession, is something that happens. Like it's you can't look at collective behaviors like you were saying, especially dark collective behaviors, and come away with any other conclusion, I don't think, because
Right.
you can clearly see something overtaking people, right? In these big
Hmm.
mobs that are doing something. Like there's something, like we just call it mob mentality. Oh, that's mob mentality. As if that
Yeah.
makes it any less weird,
No, no, it's
curious that we're like that everybody is sharing some kind of like collective psychological state, and they're all acting the same way like a herd, you know?
right, right. So some of the explanations that Marie-Louise von Franz gets into with this is this idea that first, well, why does this idea of a shadow or the unconscious come about at all in the first place? And one of these reasons is that to live in a collective society, and be cordial with one another, and also to not be an outcast personally, we have to repress some of those more
Yeah.
animalistic impulses we have. And those include what we perceive to be negative emotions, rage, lust, and all these things, and several more, sure. But as we repress them, where do they go? They have to go somewhere into the background. And those form a personal shadow. But at the same time, in each society, there's a collective shadow from the for the same reason, effectively. It could be history as well, certain events. But as we start to push things back, and to live kind of in peace in our society, and not be an outcast, and be able to function, these things start to exist on these other levels.
Hmm.
And they get expressed in fairy tales, but they also get expressed in these events, which almost like are inevitable, because those shadow elements have to find an alternative route to express themselves, because they have no symbolic or ritualistic place anymore, since we've stripped down our rituals and our religions from the more substantial rituals we used to have. So like something like the Salem witch trials, that comes about because that town, they had this they had a lot of repression in these Puritan type villages and such. And then a situation comes along where now they're allowed to you know get the woman that they feel attracted to that they can't have to accuse her of something, and then put her in a situation where they can take
Yeah.
out force on her and like cause her to be tortured, and then like for everyone to celebrate it.
It's very
It
dark.
like
Yeah.
boggles the mind that
Yeah.
it's very dark, and the fact that it exists in each of us, that
Yes.
and that's something you learn from these tales, is because when they haven't been defanged and they have
Hmm.
the morbid elements, you start to see that we're all capable of both kindness and cruelty in equal measure, but we've repressed that cruelty, in the background, to an extent, because we want to function in society, which is
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of that example, that reminds me, I mentioned that I heard this cool myth that is very, very clear psychological implications and shadow implications, at the beginning of an episode of that show Hidden Brain. I just happened to hear it when I was
Mm,
getting in the car, and I'm not even going to get the details of it right, but I'll get the punchline right at least. And I believe it's an Indian folktale or fairy tale,
mm,
and what it is it's like you have this lord and this lady, and they secretly become lovers, and they secretly have this affair that they're hiding from their families, and then they're found out, and the male that's involved, it's decided like who he's going to marry, and it's not going to be this woman that he's already uh is his lover. So what they do is they do this. Man, I wish I was doing a better job of telling this story, but
it's
basically
hard. It's hard telling a good story, man. It's true.
it's because these are such like there's such dreamy nonsensical things that would never happen, that it is easy to jumble up the details. But so what ends up happening is he ends up getting put in this situation where he gets put in front of two doors. One door
Mm,
is the lady that he is supposed to marry, not the lover, and the
mm,
other door is a tiger. Behind the other door is a tiger that will immediately
mm,
devour him. And
mm,
where it gets psychologically interesting is that the lover, the woman that he is not potentially going to marry, knows the answer to the question. She knows what's
mm,
behind each door. So he's begging her, like, please tell me, which door has the tiger in it so I don't pick the tiger. But now, what will she do? Will she like lose the fact that she sacrifice her lover because she can't have him, or will she save his
mm,
life and allow him to marry someone else? And
mm-hmm.
the it just ends without an answer. Like, it's one of those that just ends with you. It's up to the reader or the listener to
Brilliant.
decide what it is. And I think that, I mean, it's very clear what the function of that story is, and how that evokes this sort of um
Mm,
investigation of your own beliefs, your own psyche, your own shadow potentially. Um, but in a lot of other stories, it is much more unclear and much more symbolic and narrative driven, and you have to sort of, like using the Cinderella example from earlier, like there is a much more clear beginning, middle, and end to that story that resolves itself, and there's plenty of shadow material and evocative psychological stuff in there. But this is one where it's like the punchline itself is to work on yourself essentially and investigate your own mind, and think about what you would do and all the different things that you think about being put in that kind of a potential situation.
yeah, no,
Yeah.
it brings to mind, that there's other lessons in there too, or maybe, it's hard to, with a lot of these fairy tales, you can't say there's one single lesson
Right.
oftentimes, because there's more than one lens of interpretation you can use for it. And perhaps that's what proves their longevity. If you can if you can hear this tale and find some value in it, then you'll be more likely to tell it to somebody else, and maybe they'll see a different value in it and then retell it. But even in the one that you just said, in the most bare bones aspects, it reminds me of something I remember hearing. I think it was from Von Franz as well. And she said that there was an Alessand once, a
Hmm.
patient of hers, who he was having an affair with a woman. So again, this is this same
Yeah.
scenario. It's a scenario that's been played out since the beginning of time, essentially. So it's a deeply human issue,
Hmm.
in our psychology, some kind of complex that keeps presenting itself. So he has having an affair, but he also is with a partner that's his steady partner, And what ends up happening is he leaves his steady partner he's been with for over 10 years and now is with the mistress. And he's miserable.
Mm.
And he doesn't understand why he's miserable. He wanted this woman, clearly, and he wanted to leave, his steady partner that he got bored of from all those years. And what he comes to understand through the therapy is that it wasn't the mistress he was interested in. He was interested in the affair.
Mm-hmm,
He
mm-hmm.
wanted the experience of the excitement, of the newness, of those emotions. And he wanted to do something that he shouldn't be doing. He wanted to violate maybe his partner's trust, the excitement of obviously like being a kid and like having to sneak around. But then once he got what it seemed like he wanted, what he thought he wanted consciously, his unconscious is like, oh no, we got that other thing already. This is
Yeah.
you have fun dealing with this. And what would happen in that scenario, later on, years down the road, he would probably end up cheating again if he didn't have the foresight to understand that that's what happened to him. And that probably is a cycle that happens to men and women, like, yearly, all throughout, every country. It's bizarre.
Yeah, yeah. That he wanted the Venusian dalliance. He wanted to just project that that archetypal image onto something else and like live out some kind of fantasy unconsciously. But this gets back into what I wanted to ask you before, which is like, okay, so there's a personal example of something like that was essentially an unconscious shadow projection, or like I was saying, like a Venusian kind of projection, and just letting someone else represent this thing that you desire so badly, and it's not even who they really are. um but that also happens on this collective level, like we were talking about before, in groups,
Mm.
or where and it goes both ways. It can go in the direction of scapegoating, or it can go in the
Hmm.
direction of elevating someone to a ridiculous
Right.
level that they don't deserve to
Sure.
be at. So it begs the question, okay, what is the more healthy way then to express these things? What is the more
Mm.
healthy way? And obviously it's probably easier to identify in a personal hypothetical situation than it is a national one or something like that. This is going to sound elitist potentially, but I think that this is a kind of intelligence we don't talk about very often. Like there's a self sort of applied critical thinking that some
Hmm.
people have, where they're able to understand, like, okay, I'm elevating this person, whether it's in the personal example or the like political example, let's say.
Sure.
I'm elevating this person. This isn't really who they are. This is my emotions. This is my hormones. This is all of these things, my psychology playing tricks on me. And I need to like see through that fog. Some people just
Hmm.
have that ability and some people
Hmm.
don't. So,
Sure.
and also, I would imagine if I were an analyst, I would just know this is the kind of person I can tell them all this stuff and they're going to do it anyway. They're going to have to learn like by
Right.
falling right on their face. Like there's just that type of person. But that may be true. But I also think that we're in such a toxic, boiling over time right now
Mm.
that we're going to like have to probably do better than that. And I'm sure you've thought about, like we can't collectively let the United States fall on its face, right? Like that might look like a civil war. That might look like crazy. Who knows what that looks like? I don't even like want to get into hypotheticals. Um, what do you think? Like how are some of the ways that we could provide catharsis for
Right.
these shadowy things that are bubbling up in the collective unconscious? Have you thought about that?
Yeah, no, well, because the idea of this group shadow, collective shadow is disturbing to me. I've been reflecting on it. At the same time, there's further insights, from the writings of von Franz that are worth mentioning in this topic. So she says that in the context of a group shadow, that what's interesting is that the group doesn't even realize that the group shadow is there, that
Yeah.
there's these elements that are negative and maybe even self-destructive, and the group doesn't see it as a problem. And in some ways that's the reason why the group functions, and
Mhm.
why they're all together peacefully, because they all, in their personal shadows, they have similar material together. They have perhaps similar repressions, similar negative traits or
Right.
biases that unites them in a sense. And so they're united by this underlayer. And what she says that's really interesting is that the personal shadow acts like a doorway into the group shadow.
Mm.
That And the way to counteract that is for somebody to become aware of what's influencing them from their unconscious, the negative influences. And that as you become aware of what those are, you become less susceptible to the group shadow that you're in, or to the collective shadow of, a nation and such.
Mm.
And you're able to, in some ways, either just step away or sound the alarm bells and say, this is kind of out of proportion, guys.
Yes.
Uh, what are we even doing here?
Right.
And I think that's very insightful to consider, is that at the end of the day, and I think Jung continued to mention this even in his later years, close to his death, that the true work is done on the individual level, and that's what changes and alters the collective and the groups and such,
Yeah.
because the individual starts to recognize what's influencing them, starts to, in essence, become more and more conscious, because they're bringing more and more material up, or the scope of, the sphere of their consciousness is expanding into more and more areas,
Hmm.
and thereby they're able to influence the society they're in.
Yeah. I think you're totally right in that it has to start with the individual. Like no matter how complicated any of this stuff gets, because it does get, I think, this collective shadow stuff, it gets extremely complicated and nuanced. But it has to start with individuals. And it has to start with I think the way, because also the way when an individual starts working on themselves, the way they touch everyone around them changes as well.
Mm,
And
right.
then I think you get some kind of, I don't know, slow mass adoption change that eventually seeps into the zeitgeist and changes the collective direction of
Mm,
the zeitgeist. But at the same time, I also want to throw this out there because I've just thought too much about archetypal astrology and like other things we don't even think about lately. Is I'm also very open to the idea that there may just be times where it is like
mm,
the kairotic moment for certain societal upheavals where it is just like there's a clear kind of weather, like think about like the 1960s or something like that, where it's just like it's the 50s and then it's the 60s and it's different, it's just
right.
different now. And
Right.
there's all
Yeah,
these different
true.
times in history where it's like, of course you can point to a million different cultural factors and you know um, music and drugs and all these other things that are happening, but at the end of the day it's just like a huge qualitative archetypal difference that is just, maybe it is transhuman, like maybe humans are absorbing the effects of whatever that is more than they are like the cause of these changes in movement. And then it's just a choice of how do we again express that archetypal need in a better way or in a less responsible way, and it could be that too. um yeah.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, no, that's super interesting. And I totally agree. There seems to be these waves of culture, periods where just the clock turns and the tables turn, and it really does seem to have that effect. There's certain things like, the Renaissance happening, and just everybody being in the right place at the right time,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
all these brilliant minds kind of coming to the fore in one generation sometimes. But then, to riff off of what you initially said about, how much influence can one individual have in engaging their personal shadow, right?
Hmm.
Well, think about it this way, right? Dr. Carl Jung, his journey started with engaging his own shadow, essentially,
Right.
and bringing those elements into his conscious view. And just think about the insane rippling effect that procedure, that experience had on the rest of the world. Just
Yeah.
him engage, like if he was just a psychologist, so he wrote some substantial papers and whatnot, how different his path would have gone, versus he had this breakdown 1913 and he starts engaging, his inner depths, and has these visionary experiences and starts to write everything down and analyze it, and starts to understand that, this is the experience everybody shares. And what kind of crazy rippling effect that had, that starts with that one seed idea of somebody engaging with their own inner depths and then kind of revealing it out into the world. Like it's kind of a monumental thing that happens, right, in that sense.
So true, man. And it makes you think about how rare it probably truly is. And I'm not saying it's like, oh, if everybody was doing this work, um the world would just be this completely different, completely healed place. Um but when you see the power of what it really looks like when one person does it, it's
Right,
like
right.
we look at their work like it is this immortal, I don't know, evidence of
Mm,
in Jungian terms of someone that really individuated, of someone that
mm,
really went to that territory where so few people go, where so few people are able to take a step away from their obligations and their things that they just have to do every day, and really dive into those questions like it is just the exercise of a lifetime, like that they're taking this sort of great work of the self seriously. um
mm-hmm.
and doing that, eh, the other thing that makes it so rare is I think you have to have like an intelligence and an expertise that allows you to even go to those depths, because no matter who
Mm,
we're talking about, I think all the people that we remember, even we've talked about some people that were not well known in their lifetimes at all, but now we look at
mm.
them with the benefit of history and the context of history, and we see like this person was there, like this person was seriously mining into those depths that we're going to look at 100 years, 1,000 years from now and recognize that singular genius. um, and I know you're obsessed with that too. That's a lot of what you do with your show is identify those people from like whatever background or discipline they come from.
Yeah, no, that drives me in very many ways. Aside from my regular creative pursuits of creating music and writing, and to a certain extent, and visual art, the idea of yeah, finding these figures that I myself am completely fascinated in, and then kind of exploding that out into episodes worth of content that dives more into them, tries to understand the context that they were in and what they bring to humanity, in a sense, that make them creative geniuses. So yeah, currently the one obsession I have is William Blake,
Yeah.
the English poet from the late 17 to early 1800s. And he's exactly one of these figures that you described as you were talking. I was like, oh man, William Blake totally jives with this description. And he was poor all of his life. He stuck to his guns in terms of that this, his creative work, his visual art, his poetic writings were very much informed by his own spiritual sense and philosophy. And he never wavered from that vision, to the extent that, he was relatively unknown in his life. He was poor. And then within less than a century, people start to be like, wait, who was that guy? What
Yeah.
did we
Yeah.
miss? What was this train that just left the station? And then to this day, modern day, he's considered to be one of the greatest poets of the English language, one of the greatest artists of English culture. And it's just so fascinating how that happens. So like one fascinating thing also about William Blake that works well with the topics you cover in your show is this idea that he professed that he was able to see reality in fourfold vision.
Hmm.
And so scholars of Blake, they continue to try to figure out what the hell is this guy talking about,
Hmm.
fourfold vision. So there's some elements of it where we can concretely say like, okay, this is what he meant. And so part of my recent episode on William Blake, part 2 of the series, goes into uh, trying to understand what he was talking about, because there's this one letter he sends to one of his patrons, which is kind of a very commonplace letter at first, updating him about his progress on some pieces he's working on for him. And then he says, "Oh yeah, and my wife, she sends her respect, and she insisted that I include this poem within this letter uh, that I wrote while traveling to my sister's home." And so he then takes up like another 3 pages with this completely bizarre, off the wall letter that's just full of like his own esoteric references to gods that he's created and symbolic realms that no one else is going to understand. And you're like, what is he doing? What is he talking about? And so, one of the great verses from this letter that's not included in any of his books is he says, "Now I a fourfold vision see, and a fourfold vision is given to me. 'Tis fourfold in my supreme delight, and threefold in soft Beulah's night. And twofold always may God us keep from single vision and Newton's sleep." So, of course, there's the poeticness of it is just lovely, but it's just filled with a tangle of associations that are very Blakean, that make no sense to us, like the fourfold aspect, the Beulah's night, the twofold always, the Newton's sleep. So, like one area that we can maybe understand a little bit of it that'll help us get into some interesting tangents is to look at it in reverse. So, to Blake, single vision was this idea that came about through the Age of Reason and the Enlightenment, when people started to view the world scientifically. Of course, there's incredible benefits to that. There's the fact that we can even be talking right now, but at the same time, it objectifies everything in reality and makes it only one thing, matter. And this is matter, and we can measure it, and we can talk about it, and we can flip it, and we can deconstruct it, but it's only matter. It's what we see is what we get. So that's single vision. And he calls that Newton's sleep. Obviously, Isaac Newton being an important early figure of science. So,
sorry to interrupt you, but what do you think he means by sleep?
So we're going to get that. Yeah.
Okay.
So the reason he calls it Newton's sleep has to do with this other layer, which he calls double vision. And so in that little verse, he says, "And twofold always," twofold referring to double vision. So for Blake, he always viewed reality in double vision. He had that, of course, the objective layer there. But at the same time, he also viewed everything with kind of an overlay or an integration of the imagery from his imagination and the associations and symbolisms from his inner world. So, if you're viewing the world from double vision, which many artists do, and anyone who's creative usually views things like this, when you see a chair, it's not just a chair, if it would be in single vision, but you see a throne for a king. When you see the moon, it's not just the moon, you see the wife of the sun.
Yeah.
When you see a thistle plant on the road, like Blake writes about in that poem, instead of seeing just the plant, he saw a crotchety old man. And then the crotchety old man started arguing with him, and then he kicks him. And so it's this very imaginative way of viewing the world, but it also means the world is full of correspondences.
Yeah.
So it engages, your imagination. And the further back in time we look, it's clear that pre-scientific era, pre-Age of Reason, everyone viewed the world like this, through correspondences.
Yeah.
Right. You were talking about astrology before and stuff like that. So have you reflected on these kinds of things about like that there must have been a shift at some point in history where we kind of like that scalpel of reason started to take that side of us away?
Oh yeah, man. Oh yeah. And this gets into, I think, the truth behind the truth that all of these people tap into, whether it's Blake or Jung, or we go back and we start looking at people who were what we today would call mystics, or all the way back to Plato, or even pre-Socratic, people like Parmenides, like who is credited with, he might be the perfect example of this because he's credited as being the father of logic, right? He is credited with being the discoverer of logic, essentially. And how did he discover logic? By going to the underworld and talking to a goddess.
Oh.
It's that kind of thing where it's like
it's already there. It's like it doesn't take
right.
any any journey to get to it. It just starts already there. Yeah, it starts in
Yeah.
the imaginal realm.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. In the imaginal realm. It's that deeper, more piercing kind of seeing that you're talking about, where yes, there is the way the thing appears in physical reality, the things you can measure, the things you can, weigh, the things that you can do all of the objective ways to make into a distinct object, right?
Yeah,
but
yeah.
but then underneath that, I mean, but that essentially, in the platonic sense, that's the shadow on the wall, right? That's the way of looking at
Hmm.
reality that is akin to the shadow on the cave wall in Plato's um allegory of the cave. And then the person who sees deeper, who and it's perfect because there are actually four ways of knowing, for
Mm,
epistemological layers in the cave allegory,
mm,
and ontological layers too, that there
mm.
are there are like four ways of knowing. There's that way that's just purely taking the shadow literally, thinking that that's the actual world. Then to stick with the metaphorical example, then there's the thing that's projecting the shadow on the wall, and there's the thing
Right.
that's there's the object that's moving and casting the shadow. Then there's the light that's actually coming down into the cave from outside the cave. Then there's the whole world outside the cave, and then there's the sun outside the cave. So it's just like, I think all of these people are reaching the same conclusions in many ways, and they're
Hmm.
putting their own like mythopoetic language over the top of all of it,
Right.
like there's that great example from your first William Blake, yeah, it is your first Blake episode, where you're talking about the closeness, the almost indistinguishable way in which Blake talks about his trips into the mundus imaginalis, and the way Jung talks about his
All right.
active imagination. Like I think you read some Red Book stuff side by side with one of Blake's poems, and it's
Yeah.
just it sounds. I only knew because I knew exactly the Jung thing that you were reading, but yeah, it sounds indistinguishably similar. These people all at some point find their way into the realm of the imaginal, into the psyche, whatever we want to call it. Um, and then they struggle. You have to talk about it mythopoetically. They're in like a visionary way. There's no other way to talk about it.
Totally. Yeah, and so like this idea that the further back in history we go, we see people interacting with reality this way. I think the reason why it's important too is that when, let's say, you allow this imaginative aspect to interact or interface with the reality around you, you're also imbuing your environment with meaning.
Yeah.
And that's where meaning comes from. It doesn't come from the exterior world. It always originates from inside of us. When we find meaning in our lives, when we look at uh, aspects of our lives and even objects, the meaning is from within, not from without. And so when you look at historically people, if it's a Norse person crossing paths with a raven, then they start to think of the god Odin, and they start to perceive some influence there. When it's an alchemist working with the metal lead, they're going to be reflecting on the influence of Saturn, and maybe even meditating and visualizing that. When it's an ancient Greek person happening upon a crossroads, they'll imagine Hecate and maybe give an invocation. And just the richness that it imbues the world around you with is is missing completely if you just go back down to single vision, and now you're in Newton's sleep. Now
Hmm.
you're just floating through life and missing all of these other meanings, and in a sense, other internal realities that in the Western culture, in terms of Western European culture, it's like, Hermeticism, alchemy, astrology, that
Hmm.
these
Hmm.
traditions were clearly kind of interfacing with reality, and people practicing them would be engaging with. So yeah, it's interesting to consider, like, what's missing if we're not doing that.
Yeah, and I think clearly we're not collectively doing that. And also, when we're even attempting, think about even the myths that we are telling, the stories that we are telling. Um, of course, this is not true writ large. Like there is great television being made, there's great movies being made, there's great like anime series being released, books, all these things, yes. But collectively, the things that are the most popular, that are consumed by the most people, oftentimes are completely absent of these more kind of like ways to have some level of shadow catharsis that we really all do need to have. I mean, even going back to Aristotle, like this is what Aristotle said that drama was good for, right? Is that it
Mm,
provided this kind of collective catharsis for people that they didn't have a way to exercise. And it still does to a degree. I don't think we've completely lost that. But I also think
sure.
that we've lost certain kinds of it. Like
Hmm.
for instance, I think one of the ways that um for me it's impossible to divorce my mythopoetic view from the more Jungian Hillman archetypal way of viewing all of these factors in the psyche as something like gods. So for instance, things that people are really bad at embodying in a healthy way would be like their Mars, right? Like how do you
Mm,
or Aries, how do you let that anger, that heat, that physicality, that want to win, that want to dominate, how do you let that out in a healthy way?
mm,
um or the Venusian example, like how do you let that sort of like romantic erotic desire come out without like being like engaging in infidelity or something like that? And the more we repress these things, the more they're innately, I think, going to overflow in really unhealthy ways in the collective. And clearly there's a lot of that
hmm.
stirring around right now. Um, and I'm still working on these things for myself, though. If push came to shove, I could be like, well, I'll tell you how I deal with it, for better or worse. Um,
Sure.
but I mean, man, I could probably even in my own life, and I talk to a lot of mythopoetic weirdos. I think a lot of people don't think this way at all, like and are
Mm,
not thinking about these things. And if I weren't thinking about them, I think they would. Like my friend Lawrence Hillman says, "You do the gods, or the gods do you." And he means
sure.
that more. He is a archetypal astrologer, so he means that more in that way. But I mean, in the context of this conversation, it's so true. Like if you don't know those forces are within you, they're absolutely going to do you if you don't do them.
Right. Yeah. Like, yeah. One thing von Franz says in that regard is that any kind of emotion or motivation or character trait that's repressed, the further and the more strongly it's repressed, the more destructive of a force it becomes in your unconscious.
Yeah.
So the harder you try to keep something back and not integrate it in some positive, meaningful way, then the more it's going to start to kind of claw itself out in kind of these little random moments and peek through your conscious reality and cause you to do things that you can't explain. So like, here's an example, right? And this example led me to seek out going to therapy, to seek out a Jungian analyst
Yeah.
and,
Yeah.
and doing psychoanalysis. So this must have been a few months ago now, but over the course of about 3 weeks or so, um, my wife would say, let's do this in the house. Maybe we were doing a little renovation or something, and she would offer up, you know, an example of something to change, and then kind of offhanded, I would say, "Oh, that's stupid," and then I would continue. And we would continue talking. The first time she let it slide, she assumed, maybe I was having a bad day, didn't get enough sleep. The second time it happened, same phrase. Oh, that's stupid. She was like, listen, I don't appreciate you talking to me that way. My parents didn't talk to me that way. Uh, I don't know what's going on with you, but you got to fix it and get over it. And the next time you say that, we're going to have a problem. And then I'm like, you know what? You're absolutely right. I don't know why I said that. I don't know. I'm sorry. I'll make it up to you. Let's try to have a nice day. It happened a third time. I said, that's stupid. And then as I said it, I was like, ah, damn it. It came out again. And I had, we've been together, so many years, and I've never spoken to her like that before. So she she, had it out with me, rightfully so. We argued for a bit, and I was more like, just like, I don't know how it's happening, why it's happening. We were in the car, and then she's like, my parents never spoke to me that way. Did your father speak to you that way? Did your father speak to your mom that way? And I went, yeah, yeah, he did. He said that to us all the time. Yeah, he would say, what are you, stupid? Or that's stupid. And he still sometimes kind of says it.
Mm-hmm.
And then a light bulb went off in my head. And I was like, oh, I was obviously a boy, and there was the dynamic of father, son, and wife, and a husband wife thing. And now I have a little son who's at the time was only a year old. I was like, oh, is it because this dynamic is playing itself out again? And now it's bubbling up something in me because my unconscious recognizes the same dynamic. And I was like, shit, that's not good. I
Right.
don't want to be calling my wife stupid for no reason, or then eventually calling my son, saying the same things to him. And the reason I didn't recognize it at first is because my dad would say it in Polish. My parents continue to speak
Mm.
in Polish at home. And so it sounds different in Polish. It's um co ty jesteś głupia? It's that's how you'd
Mm.
say it. And so I was like, all right, it's time. I gotta go to therapy, and partially to make sure that whatever these influences are bubbling up in this dynamic of father son, household with a young boy, aren't going to keep happening. And also just because for the longest time I wanted to engage that kind of experience anyway. So yeah, that's again like one of these things, like it become when you've repressed something and haven't handled it or acknowledged it even after 20 years or more, it
Yeah.
starts to sometimes just bubble up and influence you.
Yeah, dude. And regardless, I mean, I could see some people listening to this be like, "Oh, I say that all the time. That's stupid. That's whatever." It's who fucking cares? Like, that's not a big deal. But what is a really big deal, I think, is you and your wife's unwillingness to allow these scripts to just run because like that's the way
Mm,
you were talked to, that's without stopping to actually be like, I don't actually really want to be like that, like I don't
right.
really want to communicate like that, even if that's just what I unconsciously inherited, and then you do something about it like that's what way too few people do. And a lot of people don't even like recognize, they don't even ever come to
Mm,
the conscious conclusion that they're doing that, or they just have inherited these behavior patterns. And that is a really, I mean, God bless you, MJ, because that's such like to me, compared to some of the things I see, even in my own family, sometimes there's just like this
mm,
tangled web of like all these things that I see people doing that I don't think people realize that they do, and of course I do some of them too. Um, but man, I think so few people, more importantly, take any kind of action to start to detangle that at all. And I'm glad the
mm,
conversation's going in this direction because I really wanted to ask you, as someone who I think has that kind of intelligence in spades that I talked about earlier, that kind of like critical thinking, looking at yourself, thinking about um, your the way that you approach the world, exist in the world, and then also going many layers deeper than that, like investigating the psyche at large, investigating your own psyche, your own creativity. Um, Yet like myself, you had not gone into Jungian analysis. You had,
mm.
despite your interest, despite my interest, I have not gone into Jungian analysis, but you just did somewhat recently. So I definitely wanted to hear your experiences with it as much as you're comfortable sharing. Has it
Sure.
met your expectations? Has it been different? Like what has it been like?
Yeah, yeah, no, I'm happy to talk about it because again, the potential value of convincing, a few handful of people to kind of reorganize their inner world and for the better and understand themselves, it outweighs any, oversharing or things like that might happen. So, right. So it's been about I think 3 months steady that I've been seeing my analyst for almost weekly. So once a week. And I'm going to be honest, it's not always fun. It's not, going into it, you get so nerdy with this Jungian stuff. You're reading all this stuff. You think that, every analyst is different, but you think that it's going to be like half the session, you're going to be just talking about myths ghosts and stories
Right.
and gods and like riffing on stuff and like, oh man, that's crazy. I can't believe that was in my dream. But honestly, most of the time it's I do bring in my dream journal, and we do go over like certain dreams that I feel were very significant, and we talk about why are they significant. We talk about what things may represent, and that I think is incredibly useful for me. But a lot of other time we're just kind of getting into the weeds of childhood, about actions that I've taken in my life that I regretted, about how I was raised, that maybe I wouldn't want to do that to my children. And it opens up a lot of compartments and a lot of doors inside of you that you keep closed for a reason. That um and a lot of things that come up that you wouldn't share with anybody else, also for a reason, because either they're close enough to you where that would offend them, that you have those kinds of thoughts, or
Right.
you don't want to sour that relationship, or just they wouldn't understand that whatever passing thought you may have had about them that's a negative thought, now they're going to have to carry that thought and think that that's what you think about them all the time, when it was just just that day that you had maybe a selfish or a resentful thought. And so in that regard, it's certainly not always fun, but the amount of growth, I think it's compelling and in me, and helping me in kind of opening up the next chapter of my life, and I feel that is really priceless,
Hmm.
is really something worthwhile. I think it was my second or third session. I cried for an hour,
Wow.
but it was not because they were torturing me, but because I was somehow the subject of one of my close friends who had passed away about 4 years ago now had come up. And so my analyst said, okay, well, what are you thinking about with that? What happened? And then we got into the day that he died, and I ended up kind of reliving all of those details, and it's very emotional, and that's a trauma of mine that I carry.
Yeah.
And so but there's tremendous value in bringing those things to the surface, excavating a bit, and you understand things better about yourself, and I think you live a little more at peace with yourself too, because
Wow.
that those anxieties and those complexes are just a little less tangled.
Yeah. Has it changed your idea about shadow work, doing it on yourself? Like, has it made it less abstract? Because that to me, even as someone who uh, now that I've got a video that has a lot of views on it, of course, I'm getting tons of comments all the time, like sometimes very well informed ones about shadow work. Or that have like direct questions, and I'm like, I can't answer it. I don't know. Like,
Sure.
it is still somewhat abstract to me too. So I wonder if it has become more tangible as a result.
So, I mean, the way I perhaps see it now, and maybe I haven't, formed words of this yet, but you're compelling them out of me. So, and that's great. Thank you. I would say that the types of work that I was doing before, and that I'll continue to do, which is like active imagination,
Yeah.
going into yourself, these kinds of meditations, my own dream analysis and such. During the process of now sitting with an analyst, I realized that all of that is just kind of providing uh, wood for the fire
Mm.
of analysis. But those things alone, it's almost like I'm too close to the material to see it from a bird's eye view, and all. And I think there's tremendous benefit of having another person that, whether it's an analyst or a shaman, in more ancient cultures, somebody that you can open yourself up to enough, and then they can reflect back to you something, or you can take a problem and put it in the air between the two of you, and now you're talking about this problem or this memory, triangulating with it. Uh, but otherwise, when you journal yourself, you do all that stuff, it's almost like having an analyst is an accelerant to all that,
Hmm. Hmm.
as a process, because then this other person, they kind of see the things, I think, a little more clearly as far as like paths that are happening, influences, motivations inside of you. And if they're a good analyst, unfortunately, I think I have a pretty good one, it seems, so far. They'll ask pointed questions rather than tell you what that thing is.
Mhm.
You know, because I think you mentioned it earlier. Uh, if somebody tells you what to do and what, explains everything about you, you're not going to take it in because you're not ready for it. But if you're kind of maybe like gently guided a little bit, you ask a certain question, and
Mhm.
then you're like, yeah, that's right. Why did I do that? Or, yeah, why did I have that weird symbol recurring in my dreams for years? And then you leave the analysis session, and then, a few days later, you're still kind of digesting it, still kind of chewing on it. And then you start to realize what it might be. And then you're like, oh. And then you come back the next session, and who knows if they already knew that that's what it was. But the fact that you've realized it yourself, and they compelled it out of you through, just some basic kind of prodding and questioning, I think that's one of the great values of it, honestly.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, they're like this psychopomp that knows the
Right.
territory. Like even if they're not going to tell you which way to go, but they're going to
Hmm.
be able to like cast a torch, in places that that you've never been before. Um
Yeah.
and speaking of all of this, I didn't even mean to do that, but speaking of, you were using fire symbolism, I just used it again and it reminded me of this. Um Stan Groff, he's the famous transpersonal psychologist who very influenced by Jung, wound up
Hmm.
working very heavily with psychedelics to do this kind of work. And Richard Tarnas, who's personal friends with him, said that he said something to him that he apparently like never wrote down in any of his books, but it's like one of the things that he thinks
Mm,
was like the most amazing insight from Stan Groff is he was saying
mm,
like when people have really difficult experiences during trips, um,
mm,
that emotional explosion is like the funeral pyre of that energy or of that trauma or of that thing that was
mm.
being worked out. And I think it's really interesting that you use that same imagery of like all of this stuff is sort of like tinder to be put on,
Sure.
um to be burned, to be worked on, to be released or integrated or whatever word we want to use. And
Mm,
yeah, there's something, and it's interesting too because that symbolism of fire and catharsis having to do with fire that goes all the way back to the Greek world too. Like that burning off is an image that is often used in like when talking about preparing oneself, especially like a catharsis has
mm.
to occur before one is initiated. Like it has to do with purification as well, right? The burning away of things to purify. And then also that gets into alchemy, right? It's like all of this stuff is
Right.
weirdly mythopoetically and symbolically related to fire and the burning or transformation of things through burning.
Right. You're seeing the world in double vision, my friend.
Yes, this is true. This is true.
It's
um
not fire, just fire. It's
no.
fire and all these other things.
Yeah, and that starts to get into one of these things that I'm still trying to figure out, or if I'm just gaslighting myself into making it more complicated than it really is, which is like what is really meant by elements. What is really
Mm,
meant by, like when the ancient Greeks would talk about the world really um, consisting of these four elements, and obviously the single vision way of seeing that is like they were wrong. Like they really thought there was like
right.
a little bit of fire, water, earth, and air and everything, and they were
In
just
everything.
wrong about it.
Right.
Um,
Mm.
but there's a more mythopoetic way to look at it, and I'm still, that's a great example of something I think is useful and is archetypally real. But I'm curious for you as someone who is into all of this stuff as well and very into alchemy as well. What do you think about the four elements? Like what insight do you think Plato and the alchemists were all trying, and the Hermeticists were all getting at when they all agreed on this system of four elements?
Yeah. No, I mean, one way to see it that I find very useful, it was a perspective put forward by an author, Brian Cotnoir, who wrote Practical Alchemy. It's a very
Mhm.
short book, but super dense with wonderful stuff about the actual, the actual practice of alchemy itself, not just the kind of philosophical elements. And so he said that one way to understand alchemy and kind of appreciate it from a modern lens would be that it's a way of viewing reality from maybe a lower resolution.
Hmm.
So when you view reality, nowadays we are informed by science because of our culture, and so we start to see it with like a really high def resolution.
Right.
If we sit there and think about it for a little bit, we know that all the way down there are atoms, and potentially that breaks down even further. But slightly above that, there's the periodic table of elements and all these different aspects that have ingrained in us. Have been ingrained in us since grade school to understand about the world around us. But then slightly above that, there's a resolution where the four elements exist. And this is the way, many cultures in the world that didn't even cross-pollinate their ideas viewed reality and matter. But the reason they viewed it this way, sure, there are these, very heady philosophical reasons, but it's also because reality actually works this way.
Hmm.
It actually behaves the way that is described in the four elements, and that each element has two qualities between, there's dryness, wetness, heat, and cold. And each element has two of those qualities. And depending on if you're changing one of the qualities that element doesn't normally have to one that it does have, like if you're heating one that is normally supposed to be cold, then you're changing that element's state to one of the other elements.
Yeah.
Water becomes air when you heat it, right, and stuff like this. And so I think in the brass tacks of it, when ancient people, ancient cultures interacted with the matter around them, it was behaving the way is described in the four elements. It has those qualities. It reliably behaves that way. And so I think it's a question also of resolution.
Mm-hmm.
So if you view the world from that resolution, it works. It's a framework that actually gives you a reliable way to understand reality. And then if you view the world, from the age of reason and onward, you get into another resolution of reality that also works. Eventually you get down into particle physics, and then that doesn't even work anymore the way that the other resolutions work. And it's a completely different set of rules. So I feel that that's a way that people usually don't consider alchemy in this kind of light.
For sure, yeah, and I mean, there's so many more levels to it too. Like reading the Timaeus and seeing the source of the associations between certain geometric solids and elements, and then also, man, we haven't even talked too much about this since I've been going deeper down this rabbit hole of theurgy. I talked to Dr. Gregory Shaw, who wrote this book, Theurgy and the Soul. And it's a really, really deep investigation of Iamblichus's on the mysteries, and some other Platonists as well who spoke a lot about theurgy. But this idea of, so there's not only this idea of elements associated with geometry, there is associations between gods and geometry, and we have lost some of this stuff. But like, for instance, like one example he highlights in the book is that Hermes is associated with the square, and what that actually means and how that was used is not known. But he has a whole chapter that's like essentially a educated guess based on some extant evidence and other things and stuff that's been found in Iamblichus's writings, that these geometries were actually literally used as like ritualistic technica. Like there were actually geometrical things probably on altars, and maybe sometimes they had sometimes they had like blood on them, maybe sometimes like from like sacrificial blood, or like there's all kinds of stuff, man. And then that gets my mind, as somebody who's experimented with their consciousness, then you start thinking about like, well, what about the hyperbolic geometry and visionary states? Well, like, what is that? What they might have been referring to? Like when they, when they reached a state of consciousness where the flower of life sort of motif started to emerge, where they like, oh, the goddess, or things like that. Like, I don't
totally
know, but I do think again, going back into the fourfold vision, to use Blake's terminology, I think especially when you're getting into some of the higher levels of initiation that were beyond the theoretical, and you really were going into what I think absolutely was going on with visionary states back then, in things like the Eleusinian mysteries, or even just probably even higher level initiations in Platonism and various esoteric schools. I do think they're marrying all four types of this vision. I think that they're all of this is there for the initiated to see, when you're, especially when you're reading something like the Timaeus. It's like not even debatable. There's tons of
Mm.
references to sacred geometry and things that clearly you would only know if you've gone through the proper initiations and stuff like that.
Yeah. No, it's a fascinating concept. I mean, what it calls to mind is, let's say, we have a tendency to think that, and in some ways it's true, that those mystery traditions have been, in a sense, repressed by the cultural consciousness, right? They kind of have been pushed into the background because they do exist, but people don't talk about them, and people think that they've died out. I have a friend who participates in an Orphic tradition, and he's an Orphic priest in an ancient Greek native tradition. And his family is from a lineage of families that have continued that tradition, despite the Catholic Church of the early centuries banning it and destroying the temples where it was practiced. And so these mystery traditions continue because people need those experiences. They seek them out. And so, in a similar light, a tradition like Freemasonry, which the reason I thought of it is because when you said, geometry on the
Right,
altar.
right, right, right.
So, one of the explanations of the letter G in Freemasonry, which is positioned, high above the throne that's in the east of what's called the worshipful master, is one explanation is that the G represents geometry. And then if you consider, well, how far can we take that? Does it have some truth to it? Well, then if you look at the altar in a Masonic lodge, what do you see? You see a square and compass. I mean, there's
Right.
symbols of geometry, right?
Yeah.
There's symbols of creating a circle, creating a square. And what's fascinating also about a square and compass, when you play with them and when you research how Gothic cathedrals are designed, almost everything that you see on a Gothic cathedral can be designed or thought up using a square and compass, some kind of combination of a straight edge, right angle, a circle, concentric circles overlapping, and then you choose a certain shape out of the concentric circles overlapping. And it's super fascinating to consider, that these traditions still exist, and maybe the idea of geometry is an echo from an even earlier thread like the one you were saying.
For sure. I mean, and I think all the Platonic solids are examples of that too. They're all things, I'm sure, that can be made out of a square and compass. And they're all that kind of
Mm,
like Euclidean geometry that is like
mm,
so familiar. It's so familiar to us that we innately design using those solids all the time, even now. Like it's not like we discovered non-Euclidean geometry and then suddenly suddenly like we're using like weird. No, we still use that all the time. Like that's just the way that we
mm,
think, the way that something in the psyche, it appeals to us. Like our, you could call it our like our attachment to the noose, or our attachment to that demiurgic consciousness. It's
mm.
like we're just tapping into that very same thing. That's the fabric of the universe, I think. And I think that that's what Freemasons think. I think that's what Platonists think. I think that's what Hermeticists think. And I think you can experience that for yourself in these peak states, like that. The this illusion of division, it's very illusory, especially when we're talking about psyche and we're talking about the mental. You suddenly realize that that extends far beyond you, and you're just one
Sure.
instantiation of that. And you're, but not only, you're not just like this. And this is what's so missing today, I think, is like
Mm,
this feeling that you're separate, like you're this thing that is
mm.
separate and not connected. But then there are these states of consciousness you can arrive at where like, oh, I'm unique but I'm connected, like I'm absolutely
Ah,
connected to all the very same stuff, the very same ideas that are like coursing throughout reality. um
right.
but as always, man, This has been such a fucking fantastic conversation. I love these little tangents that we're going off at the end here because they're just like this. This is just what's so fun talking to someone like you, is you have this really rich mythopoetic, esoteric background. I have all of my stuff that I'm bringing, and I think just bouncing it off of one another is just so much fun. I know you got to go
Oh,
soon though.
it's a blast, my friend. Um, yeah, I do have to go soon, but what should we bookend this with? I have a story from the Grimm's fairy tales that kind of brings us back into the shadow element of things we were talking about. Or do you have any?
Whatever you want.
Yeah,
I'm not. I got as much time as you want, as whatever riffs are burning in that pocket of yours.
yeah.
Let
Please,
them.
I want to get this one. There's
Yeah.
somebody out there listening to your show right now that's going to want to hear this story about the dog and the sparrow. I think
I want to hear it.
it's going to move them in some way that they need to be moved. So just to follow my intuition. So it's going to get us off of this wonderful soup that we've been cooking, but it'll bring us back to the shadow stuff. So, I once every night we have this ritual with my daughter where we read her something for bedtime, and so our content or our books were getting kind of stale. So I was like, "Oh, I got this book of Grimm's fairy tales. Why don't we just grab something from there?" I had no idea what I was getting into at the time. This was years ago now. She was 7 at the time. So I grabbed this thing, we lay down. I'm like, all right, what stories should we pick? Maybe not the ones that we're already used to, maybe something short. And so I see one running my fingers. It's The Dog and the Sparrow. Oh, that sounds pleasant enough. We have dogs. I love sparrows. Let's choose this one. So anyway, within like a few lines, I almost like permanently traumatized my poor daughter, 7 years old at the time, and she hit her face as I was reading, and I was like, uh do you not like this, huh? And then she goes, I'm like, oh, right. Yeah, this is a little inappropriate. So, bringing us back to this idea that, in the original tales, they probably weren't meant for kids, or the kids were used to,
Right. Yeah.
being surrounded by death and gore all the
Right. Yeah.
time. So it was commonplace. So, okay, I'll abridge this story of the dog and the sparrow, leaving only these integral details. So the story goes that there was a dog that was very mistreated. He was a sheepdog, and he was malnourished. And one day he had enough, and so he left his master's care and went roaming in the roads outside of town. And while he was roaming, little sparrows on a tree saw him, and he felt bad for him, and he called out to him and said, "My brother, dear dog, why do you look so sad?" And the dog said, "I'm starving. I haven't eaten in days." And so the sparrow said, "Oh, no problem. Follow me into the town. I'll get you something to eat." So they go into the town. They go to a meat seller's stall, and the bird is able to peck down a piece of steak, and the dog catches it in its jaws and scurries off and eats it in the corner. The sparrow asks him right afterward, "Dog, are you satisfied?" And the dog says, "For meat, yes, but not for bread. I'm still wanting." And so the sparrow says, "Okay, let's fly over here." They go to the baker's stall, and he knocks down a few pieces of rolls. The dog scarfs them down, scurries off, and then the sparrow asks him, "My brother dog, are you satisfied now?" And the dog says, "Yes, let's walk out of this town and go back to the roads outside where I can rest." So they do, and the dog is nice and full tummy now. He can finally relax, and he lays down in the middle of one of these roads. And the sparrow just kind of uh, lits on a tree right above him and just watches. Shortly after, the sparrow starts to hear this very loud noise, like a turning, like a turbulent dirt and everything. And he looks, and down the road, there's a large wagon that's being led by two massive horses, and a man is driving it, and that there's two big wine casks that it's carrying. And he starts to realize that that wagon is going to run over the dog if it doesn't stop. So he flies over and tries to warn the cartman of the carriage, but the carter doesn't care. He shoos the bird away, and the wagon kills the dog, just smashes through it. The bird is furious, and the bird's like, "What? Unbelievable! This I don't know what to do." So he flies over and tries to get the cartman's attention. The cart has stopped, and so he starts to peck at the wine barrels. And he said, "This wretched man, he'll see what revenge we can get." And the wine starts to spill out. The cartman starts to drive off again, not a care in the world. And then eventually he looks back and he sees all of his wine has spilled out. And he said, "Ah, what a miserable wretch I am. I've lost all my wine." And then the sparrow says, "Not miserable enough yet." He swoops down and starts to peck at the eyes of his horses and actually blinds one horse. So the cartman takes a hatchet and tries to hit the sparrow. The sparrow flies off and he hits his horse dead. It just falls right
God.
over.
Yeah.
The sparrow now flies over to the other horse, starts to peck out its eyes. The cartman says, "No." He hits him. And of course, the sparrow evades it. The horse is dead before it hits the ground. And he says, "What miserable wretch am I? I've lost my wine. I've lost my horses." And then the sparrow, flying into a tree, says, "Not miserable enough yet." So the cartman walks home. He gets home. His wife is like, "Husband, where have you been?" And he says, "You won't believe it. What miserable wretch am I? I've lost our wine. I've lost our horses." And she says, "That's unbelievable. Just as you came in, all the birds of the town lit down in our garden and have been eating all of our crops." And he goes, "What?" And they go to the open window and they see so many birds. And right on the windowsill, the sparrow comes and lands. And the man says, "That's him. That's the one." Grabs his hatchet. The bird flies in. He's trying to chase this bird, kill it. In the process, he's smashing all of the dishes. He's cutting all the furniture. He's messing up the entire place. And then finally, the woman catches the bird, and the man says, "Give it to me." He takes it, snatches it in his hand, but the bird is wrestling free. And the man says, "You've made such a miserable wretch of me." And then the bird says, "You will still pay for it with thy life." And as he's wriggling free, the man has no other idea but to just shove him in his mouth. So he puts the bird in his mouth to keep him still. And then the woman grabs the hatchet and she's like, and just then the bird flies out and she hits her husband right in the face, full force. He falls down, drops down dead. The bird just flies out the window and returns to its nest.
So
The end.
what's traumatizing about that?
Yeah, it only took the two horses to get hit in the head with a hatchet
Yeah,
before I stopped the story. Good thing I
right.
stopped. It goes downhill from there.
Yeah, that's wild. That's wild. And now we don't even have time to analyze this story.
Well, let's maybe take 5 minutes because the
Okay, yeah,
moral,
no, I'm down.
yeah, one moral that you can glean from it or that I have is unexpected, but it feels correct to me anyway. So initially, obviously, it seems like the dog is a central character.
Right.
Plot twist. Right when you start to feel for the dog, is killed, and then I think what we have a hard time doing is projecting our own selves into animals of stories. We
Yeah.
assume that the humans are the characters that we're supposed to associate with. I think what's happening here, it's probably traces back to more pagan roots, with certainly reverence for the potential for nature to have sovereignty and a destructive character of its own and a dark side. But I think what's happening here psychologically is we can say that following the sparrow as the main character, it starts from a position of showing incredible sympathy for the dog, right? Helping him out for no reason and making sure he's okay, and then trying to save him as he's about to be killed. And then, of course, following that, the sparrow turns into a separate character, like an evil version of itself. And so to me, one of the kind of um, ways that it's made out of the content of the psyche is that it shows us that all of us are composed of both cruelty and kindness alike, and it only takes the wrong set of circumstances to
Right.
bring out this shadow element and for us to become like a ravenous murderer in a
Yeah.
sense, right? And that's sometimes what our movies are about, is like dystopian futures where humanity crumbles, and we are now living our shadow elements rather than our positive side. And so that's one element I gleaned from it
Yeah.
as a moral of sorts.
Yeah, it definitely seems like it also speaks to the ravenousness of revenge and
Mm,
justice and how it can just go way too far and become incredibly
mm,
destructive, and where it's not even two wrongs don't make a right. It's like how many wrongs do we need before we feel like justice has been served, or before
mm.
someone has learned their lesson or something like that. And yeah, that's not going on today in the world at all.
Sure. Yeah. No. Maybe a little bit. Right. But I think it brings to the fore that, I mean, in this, who knows how many centuries old this story is, but people were facing the same problems, the same issues of,
Yes,
I feel like I really want to get back at that
totally.
mother effer.
Yes,
Like
yes,
how much can I destroy him and bring him to his knees, for doing this or that, to me. And just that's a little harmless sparrow can be brought to, create such destruction. Is kind of telling that, how much destruction can each of us have on between, the people we love to the people we hate.
for sure. Yeah, it's absolutely an example of archetypal drunkenness, or like you were saying the gods aren't in the fairy tales, but man, the gods are all over that story, right? Like that is wrath, that is
Mm,
Ares, that is revenge, like that. Those I think are gods. Like I think that that's what we
mm,
lose when we start thinking of gods or God as this thing that's like way out there, way abstract, way just like pray to it and hope it takes pity on you. And then
mm,
versus, this is definitely to your point, the more polytheist or pagan way of looking at these things as forces that are in the world, forces that are always
mm,
playing, forces that are always trying to work their way into the world through physical agents. Um,
mm.
yeah, and it could absolutely just be a little sparrow, right? But if it's a sparrow armed with the tools of Ares or whatever, it's a force to be reckoned with.
Yeah, beautifully put, my friend.
Well, hey man, always fun rapping with you. I could talk to you all day, and someday I hope we do. But tell people,
Marathon.
yeah, yeah, or just an actual hang, an in-person hang sometime.
Yeah,
Um,
sure.
uh, but yeah, what do you want to point people toward anything, or should I just throw the links in after the fact?
Sure. Yeah, everybody can find, my show, Creative Codex, on Spotify or any podcast player. We have a YouTube channel now. I posted some stuff on there recently about Hieronymus Bosch and the Garden of Earthly Delights, which is getting a lot of good attention, so that's fun.
Awesome.
So yeah, Creative Codex, CODEX. Check it out. I'll be there.